The archive is often thought of as a physical place to hold records, documents, and photographs. Just to name a few of the documents we often think of. We often think of the archives as the things that people will want to look at in the future. For me, the archive is also a place of stories. These documents tell us stories about who we are, our families, our communities, our culture. So, when I learned that Louise Erdrich used archival work in her writing, it continued to make me think about what is possible through the archives and how the archives is a place of stories. Over this last spring semester, I was in an author study course focusing on Erdrich, and in it I had the opportunity to read 7 of Erdrich's fiction books, a handful of her poems, and an excerpt of her nonfiction memoir, Books and Islands in Ojibwe Country. If you're not familiar, Louise Erdrich is an accomplished Native American author. Erdrich is half German and half Chippewa, being an enrolled member of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa. And in her writing, she often draws from her personal and cultural stories. In one interview, she talks about how she gets inspiration for her books.
And does your fiction spring from memory or is it your imagination?
Both. Some from memory, some invented. And some of the books, for instance, The Master Butcher Singing Club was inspired by the German side of my family in World War I.
Erdrich's writing style is often compared to William Faulkner because in both of their books, they've created interconnected, realistic, but fictionalized locations for their characters. In Erdrich's work, there's an emphasis on place in history. In doing so, she really creates a community and home through her novels that are both situated in her cultural and personal stories and the imagined experiences of her characters. I found this home that Erdrich is shaping for her characters as familiar and comforting, and for me, they are not just stories, characters, and places. They are more. They speak to real experiences and communities. In interviews with Erdrich, I realized that her approach to writing comes out of her personal experience with her family and her culture, which really shapes an understanding the work she does and use of archives to tell stories, to do this mending of reality and fiction with her texts.
My mother's side of the family is Turtle Mountain Chippewa, and her father was a magnificent storyteller. My mother also was herself. It's not that, people sit around and sort of formally come up with a story. It's more in the context of a typical family gathering where people have reminiscences and memories and maybe embroider a little and laugh on about certain parts of the family history. Or, as my father does, pick out certain local pieces of history and memorize them and tell them as stories.
In this interview, Erdrich talks directly about some of her personal experiences and engagement with storytellers in her life, her mother, her grandfather, and her father. And what becomes apparent for me is that Erdrich's archive isn't just documents, like her dad uses to tell stories, but they're the embodiment of experiences. And so, what was really interesting is in class while reading the book The Plague of Doves, we were assigned to listen to a supplemental NPR audio where I learned that the unsolved murder with the lynching of innocent indigenous folk that is a part of the central plot of the novel was an actual murder and lynching that Erdrich refers to and references. I am particularly interested in how Erdrich uses and relies on her cultural knowledge and the archival stories and documents, which became revealed to me through these interviews around her books. And The Plague of Doves is not the only book she does this, but it's the book I want to focus on. So, in creating this video, I'll be sharing my research methodologies and really focus on this use of archives in The Plague of Doves. By doing so, I hope to show how Erdrich is able to shape stories that are both situated and imagined. But before I keep going, I need to introduce you to who I am. My name is Elizabeth Elliott. I am a mixed race, queer, non binary woman. I call Kent, Washington home, which are the traditional lands of the Duwamish, Muckleshoot, Pasu, Umatala, and Walla Walla peoples. My immediate family still lives in Washington, but I moved to Kansas in the summer of 2023 to attend Kansas State University for my master's in English. At the time of creating this video, I'm in my last semester of my program, and I realized through my time at K-State, I've continued to center the question, what is home? In my scholarship, this question continues to be resonant and surface for me because I've been far from loved ones and the only home I've ever known. Other questions related to that have emerged alongside are what does it mean to leave home? What does it mean to create home? And who is home in Kansas? My time at K-State has brought me to these questions as I've tried to make sense of my present and my surroundings, particularly through my sharing of my own personal stories, examining of archival documents, and collaborating with others. I center this video on the questions, how does Erdrich use archives for the Plague of Doves? And what is the potential of archival work? To continue thinking through my own interest in using archives to tell stories, reclaim connections, and envision home through my research on the flooding of Washunga, Oklahoma, for the creation of Kalenk, and examine the historical positioning of African Americans in the Midwest, including Kansas. I'm interested in what stories are possible through using the archives, and so when I learned that Erdrich's book, The Plague of Dove, used real stories to the central plot, it made me want to further examine this novel and see what I can learn. And so I hope that through this research, I learn more about how to give time, space, and matter to the stories I carry. Now, turning to Erdrich's The Plague of Doves, I've seen archives really emerge in three ways. The first way Erdrich uses the archive is kind of these plot points and narrative events. The second has to do with community archiving and community holding of stories and telling of stories. And the third is kind of physical embodiments and physical memorabilia. Here I'm thinking about the tree and the stamps. I want to focus on the real events that Erdrich is focusing on, specifically the murder and the lynching. I want to first start with the NPR audio that made me realize she was drawing from history and like drawing from a real event. So for a little context, the interviewer is also identifying how Erdrich is like interlaying multiple archival stories, first with the story of the Plague of Doves itself, and then with the second one of the lynching and murder.
We have this incident that you based the first short story and then that expanded into the novel. There's another story, and it is really a vortex of this particular one. It's a lynching that happened in, was it 1911? And it affects every character in the book.
Yes, and that is from another true event. And that event was so powerful for me that it stayed with me for 20 years.
What was the basic story?
The basic story was there was a brutal murder of a farm family in Emmons County, North Dakota. There were 3 Native American men hanged. One of them was only 13. He was just a boy. I came across a picture of this hanging not long ago. It was sold on the internet, and they'd used a beef windlass. It's a tremendously troubling event in my mind.
I was shocked to hear this was from a real event, and then in the audio, Erdrich goes on to talk more about how the event occurred and some of the details. And it started to place make the reality and like why it was so haunting for the characters because it was haunting for Erdrich. When I re-listened to this audio and then was skimming through the transcript, I realized Erdrich also said the name of the town this happened, and so I decided to do a little bit more research and see if I could find some of the information related to it. What I found was even more shocking, and honestly, I don't know what to make of it just yet. I found a New York Times article accounting what happened, the names of the victims, and I realized that Erdrich named one of the characters after one of the real life victims. So Holy Track. And then I started to go back to the Plague of Doves and look for the key places that Holy Tract is talked about. And for me as a reader, it adds another layer of significance and haunting and pain to the story that wasn't there before. And so let me read you a couple of the sections so we can begin to piece together how she's talking about Holy Tract and giving him a story. The first time we get information regarding the lynching in the book is on page 17, and along with the identification of the lynching by Musham, we also get Holy Track's name. So, quote, this was Western North Dakota at the turn of the last century, even years later, when an entire family was murdered outside Pluto. 4 Indians, including a boy called Holy Track, were blamed and caught by a mob. Here, as we get information about the lynching and really start to dive into the story, which then gets layered on throughout the book, and we get more and more pieces throughout, we start to understand who was involved. And I think it's really interesting that there's explicitly an identification of Holy Trust. As we get more of the pieces layered on, because Musham's the only survivor of the lynching, he's primarily the person telling the story. But there are moments when other characters add to the story, such as Sister Anita Mary. So we get the story of why Holy Track is named Holy Track, which is because of his boots, on page 57 to page 59. We're getting the story told from Musham. And reading this section, it's interesting because I realize Holy Track doesn't get a quote, like he doesn't get to speak. His mom says something that Musham remembers, but Holy Track in himself doesn't get any dialogue. We only get information about it from Musham and how Musham thinks that Holy Track might have been feeling. For example, quote, at first the boots must have cut, said Musham, but by the time he saw the boy again, he had bound his feet in strips of leather and had gradually gotten used to their weight. People came to believe that his mother was right about the boots, for her son did not begin to cough. After some time, because he left tracks printed with a cross, the people began to call him Holy Track. And looking back at the archive, I wonder if it's because that's what's left of him in the archive, his name. And in the book, his shoes, which he gets his name from, are what's left of him, which Evie and Musham go and put on the tree. So we get that from 252 to 253, where Musham and Evie are memorializing him. And when I was doing this research, it made me want to try to find the tree in North Dakota, but I didn't know where to look. I also don't know what I would have done if I had found it. I don't know what I was looking for. Instead, I found other people doing reparative work around hanging trees and putting together stories. So I found someone who does work creating guitars out of hanging trees, which continues to do a very similar creative work of Erdrich of trying to restore stories and helping us be reminded of how the past is a part of our present and like they aren't separate entities. They are interconnected. We cannot be in the present without the past. The blending of reality and fiction that Erdrich does, specifically with Holy Track and the incident of the lynching, changes my relationship to the past. It makes me think about how it's present and like continues to be present in my reality and also in other people who experience racism, sexism, classism, among other types of minorizations. And so seeing Erdrich's work and how she uses the archives, but then restores it in a way to create a new story and make it present makes me rethink about my own relationship to using the archives. So I want to leave you with the lessons I learned from this work. I also must acknowledge that I am a storyteller, and yet I don't know how to tell the story about my time in Kansas and in grad school. I've been struggling with how to discuss the disconnection I felt in my academic spaces to tell my stories and the form of these stories. Urgic stories provide another avenue of using and relying on archives to imagine the past, present, and future differently, which is what I aspire to do with my nonfiction work. For me, Erdrich's work makes me further think through what is possible with archival research and how the past isn't simply past, but a part of the present and the future when it gets returned to. And in literature and other types of creative work, the archives is a rich narrative and place to tell stories and expand from. It makes me think, what would it look like if our current cultural narrative didn't just use the rhetoric that the future will be better to fix the issues of racism, sexism, colonialism, and etc. that we are and have been facing. Erdrich's book starts to tell me why we need to address this question and how we need to be present to the past and the ways in which we can think about that impact on people.